So it's a lie. That's not the American constitutional tradition. That's not the American political tradition. It's a total inverse and reversal of what the founders believed and what they practiced for hundreds of years. I mean, blasphemy laws continue well into the 20th century. Not always enforced, but on the books, and there was a understanding there that like there was this the civil law element of it, and then there was the law of fashion, the kind of the decorum, and these work together. But all that's been reversed.
Welcome to the Kalos Center podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Kalos Center podcast. Today we'll hear part 2 of my conversation with political scholar Ben Crenshaw. Previously, Ben and I discussed the impact and significance of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Here in the second half of our conversation, we'll turn our attention to a different but somewhat related issue of the right of free speech. So the problem, essentially, if I can kind of paraphrase what you've said, is that the critical attitude towards cancel cultures has been too broad of a brush, that not all, let's say, laws of fashion are equal. It's one thing to cancel, terminate, professionally discipline someone because they have been mocking Charlie Kirk, his mourners, his widow, celebrating his murder. And then it's quite another to fire someone because they have declared publicly that there are just two genders, right? People getting fired for asserting just basic biological facts that even a 6-year-old kid knows. So let's be properly nuanced when it comes to our assessment of people and the claims that they make and how and which laws of fashion are observed.
Yeah, that's correct. There's not only no moral equivalency between the two sides. There's no biological equivalency, historical equivalency, natural, divine, theological. You take every single category and you could just go right down the line and say the left has just propagated lies, falsehoods, radical ideas, totally out of step with what was considered to be, beyond question just 25 years ago, 50 years ago. Then that was known for hundreds and thousands of years. So yeah, there is no symmetry or equivalency here, and I think we have to hammer that point home.
All right, so let's get to the foundation, the conceptual foundations of this. Talk about what exactly the constitutional right of free speech is and what are its proper limits.
Okay, this is a huge topic. I will not be able to do it justice, but I'll try to outline it a little bit for the audience. So the constitutional right to free speech, what you have to do here is you have to do American political philosophy before you can do constitutional law. The Constitution comes later. It's a reflection of the American political thought. So let me outline a couple of different kind of, I would say, 6 main ideas that the founding generation in America, their consensus on speech. And it was first that there is a natural right or a fundamental right to non-injurious speech. So there's a default that we are speaking creatures and we should be able to speak. We have to speak. This is in many ways what makes us human. Logos, speech, reason. And I'll come back to this in a minute. And so we should be able to speak, but in a non-injurious way. But on the flip side, government is therefore obliged to either discourage or limit or punish injurious speech. So comes a question of what is non-injurious speech versus injurious speech. And I'll return to that. The third thing is that if government punishes injurious speech, they have to do so through due process of law. So it can't be capricious. It has to be by kind of the judicial principles that were both inherited and then articulated in the state and the federal national constitution. So if someone accuses you of speaking injuriously, you are charged and found guilty. Well, that whole process has to happen through court, a jury, trial of one's peers, you're presumed innocent, and so forth and so on. In addition, government can't impose prior restraints on speech, meaning an entire licensing regime that says, we are going to punish you or restrict you before you do something bad to prevent you from doing something bad. That gives too much power to the government to abuse regulation of speech. So really government can certainly set out the boundaries of what's considered injurious speech. And then, but it can only have power after the fact to correct those who break those laws. The fifth thing is that private associations have a lot of freedom to limit or to dictate the speech within their private associations. So there is a distinction between the power of government and the power of private associations. And in this sense, private associations are considered in certain ways as being like individuals. So there's collective individual or a uh, company as a public person, something like that. And then the last thing is that government, as kind of a property owner, has the same free speech rights as a private association. So that kind of like that's the in many ways the philosophy and the core here is in the Constitution. It deals, what's the first word of the First Amendment? Congress. So the first thing is that the First Amendment free speech clause restricts Congress only. And so we're dealing with a federal structure in the United States in which we have to always make originally within the Constitution. You have to make a distinction between the national government and the state government. And the national government and state government basically had different jurisdictions, different limitations, different privileges or prerogatives. So Congress cannot restrict, kind of blanket restrict the speech of everybody in the nation, even if state governments were given more leeway to do that in particular moral cases. But what's really key here, Jim, is that the right to free speech in the Constitution, the national Constitution and the state constitutions, was primarily conceived of by the founders as being a political right, meaning it was the right to gather in political assemblies, to articulate common causes and ideas, to petition your government, to elect your representatives, for your representatives to be able to speak without prohibition in their assemblies. And what you find over and over again, especially in the state constitutions, is something like, say, New Hampshire's Constitution of 1784 says this: the freedom of deliberation, speech, and debate in either house of the legislature is so essential to the rights of the people that it cannot be the foundation of any action, complaint, or prosecution in any other court or place whatsoever. And this is repeated in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Michigan, all their early state constitutions. It was conceived as fundamentally as a political right to be able to speak and act together as the people, and especially people's representatives, to not be gagged in their legislative houses from speaking openly and debating issues. Now, there was also kind of a concomitant private right of free speech in private society. And you find this in a few constitutions like Vermont and so forth. But it's important to recognize that the First Amendment and the constitutional right to free speech, first of all, only limits Congress. It does not necessarily limit the states. And it's focused on political speech because Congress has jurisdiction over kind of the great and national things of all the people and all the states together. It's a more explicitly a political constitution for their national life together, whereas the states reserved what was known as police powers. It's health, safety, morals, religion of the people were left to the states to regulate. So the national government's not going to get into state economic affairs. It's not going to regulate the religion of the states. It's not going to deal with, tort cases at the state level and so forth. So the states, most of the legislation and the life of the people was handled at the state level. So that gives you kind of like the broad overview. And I'll say a couple of the things before we can get into maybe, more properly what is the limits of the right to speech. And that is that the founding generation always made a distinction between liberty and license. So you talk about the freedom of speech, liberty of speech and of the press. What do they mean by liberty? Well, they said on the one hand, you can have tyranny. On the other hand, you can have license. License is a form of tyranny. So traditionally, tyranny was an external form of coercion or oppression that took away someone's freedom, restrained you priorly, oppressed you, threatened to, very harshly punish or kill you if you did something. That's one form of suppression, oppression, and tyranny. The other form, though, is if you give too much freedom, and it's really not giving too much freedom. The founders' understanding of liberty is really kind of a Aristotelian golden mean, in which if you go too far, one way or the other way, you get excess that turns into a vice. It's not really too much freedom. You can't have too much freedom. If you have true freedom, you can push it to its ultimate maximum and always be good and beautiful and moral and ordered. And you can be as free as you can possibly be, and it'll be wonderful. That's the kind of freedom God has. Um, but it just colloquially, we could say too much freedom leads to license. And that is when you are a slave to yourself, to your own passions. And there is no restraint, there's no internal restraint. And the founders would say, um, you know, eh, this kind of freedom is not freedom. It is a self-slavery. And their basic formula was that a republican government, small r republican, meaning a government by the people, in which there's a consent of the people and a close connection between the people and the representatives. Um, you cannot have a republican government, form of government, without virtue in the people. And you cannot have virtue without religion, without true piety, without understanding that I am not just a material being. This is not just methodological naturalism and public atheism, but I am created by God. I have a soul. My soul will live afterwards. There is a supreme God of the universe who will judge me. There is a reward and punishments in the afterlife. This is not the only life that there is. So they would say you need that, at least that, the very minimum, that understanding of religion or Christianity in order to have true virtue, in order to have kind of self-government that wells up from within, that leads to true liberty and not license and not tyranny. So this applies to every single right that they talk about in the Constitution, the Bills of Rights, whether it's the U.S. Constitution or the state constitutions. Every conception of liberty, the conservatives in the 20th century would call it ordered liberty, the common contemporary term on the right. They didn't talk that way. They just talked about true liberty or moral liberty or Christian liberty. They even used the term Christian liberty. And so to wrap up this section, like they made a distinction between liberty and license, or liberty and tyranny. And this applies to speech. And so this is why they said, well, certain kinds of injurious speech either fall into tyranny on the one hand or license on the other. Neither one of them is liberty. Neither one of them is true speech. And so now we have to figure out what is the standard for tyranny and license, and then what specific areas did they call injurious speech.
Okay, that's helpful. So with that in mind, particularly given the very wording of that First Amendment, that the Congress shall make no law that abridges that freedom of speech, among other things. Do you think that this right is right now in our country, in our contemporary moment, under an especially great threat? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Yes, I do. And this is why. When you look into what the founders believed was a true freedom of speech, they first of all did not believe that government ought to regulate for truth versus error. It's not just like, well, if you say something false, or if you're philosophizing about an error or falsehood or something like that, if you write a treatise and it turns out to be completely wrong, then you can be censored. The standard was not just like bare truth or falsehood. No, the standard was specific areas that were false, that were injurious. So this included seditious libel, criminal conspiracy. No person in a civil polity has a right to turn the people against their own government if that own government is something that they have consented to and they have established and they agree with and want to live under. So every government, by definition, has an interest in preserving itself. Seditious libel can be prosecuted by the national government or by state governments. Criminal conspiracy can be speech that involves conspiring with others or encouraging others to commit crimes. That's illegal at both the national and the state level. In terms of the specific areas where states originally had domain, that included personal libel. So they thought that a person's reputation was in many ways equal to their life. If you slander and destroy a person's reputation in public, you may make it that their wife divorces them on the basis of a slanderous falsehood. Their children might disown them. They might lose their job and their livelihood. They could be dispossessed, and they might kill themselves. So you don't have the right to maliciously and intentionally slander someone and say falsehoods about them. That can be treated in state court. You could bring a charge against somebody. Also blasphemy. Blasphemy against God. Intentionally, not just writing a public treatise like Thomas Paine did on the Age of Reason or the Rights of Man, in which you're debating with others about the nature of God in relation to humans and civilization and so forth. But no, like the malicious intent of deprecating and impugning the religion of the people by saying things that are clearly offensive to the people and false. In my American Reformer article, I touch on a couple cases where you can see this in Massachusetts and New York, Pennsylvania, and then just generally obscenity, pornography, malicious speech. So all of these areas, they thought none of these were protected under free speech, not at the national level, not at the state level. So what has happened? Well, what's happened is basically all of that's been reversed, and some of it comes through, uh, political movements in the 20th century. A lot of it comes through, Supreme Court cases and jurisprudence. Some of it through, say the work of Rawls and other, um, um, kind of secular political philosophers. And what we have today is kind of this absolutist concept of speech, according to what we might call a John Stuart Mill no harm principle. And we use the same terminology like injurious versus uninjurious speech, harm, not harming. But I mean, this basic libertarian principle is so watered down to just like if speech meets the level of basically criminal conspiracy leading to the physical harm of someone's body, that's the only time in which you can intervene. Blasphemy has been eliminated as a standard of injurious speech. Obscenity wiped away in the 1966 case of Memoirs versus Massachusetts. Freedom of the press, of speech there. Originally, it was that the press had the freedom of the press, or the right of the press to speak, was predicated upon their good intention to seek the truth and to kind of like get to the bottom of the issue publicly for all sides involved. And so it was actually their burden to show that their speech was not intentionally malicious, was not a false statement for the purpose of propagating a falsehood in public. But the New York Times Company versus Sullivan case in 1964 reversed the burden of proof. Said now, no, the public official who is being, told a falsehood by, some reporter somewhere, they have the proof to show that there's some kind of actual malice standard on the part of the reporter. And to prove an actual malice is virtually impossible. Like, how can you get inside someone's psyche and say, you knew that it was false when you said it? Of course, the reporter could always come back and say, oh, no, I really thought it was true. I didn't know it was false. So in many ways, the court has reversed the freedom of speech, moral standard, real true liberty standard that the founders believed into what we call free expression. And I want to make this point. It's really important. The founders understood speech in terms of the Aristotelian category, the ancient Greek category of logos. Speech is reason. It is, in many ways, the connection between the divine and the human. And what Aristotle said distinguishes man from the beast is not just that he has noise. He doesn't just have phone. Phone is just communication, noise. Animals use noise to communicate with each other all the time. No, man has logos. He has this capacity to make moral distinctions between what is good, what is evil, what is profitable, what is unprofitable, what is beautiful, and what is ugly. And on that basis, the people in their public deliberation and their common speech attempt to establish a political commonwealth, not just for the preservation of mere life, but the good life, a life worth living, which is a higher and noble calling according to what is good and what is beautiful and what is truly profitable. So what's happened is that was the view that the American founders took. They're always talking in moral tones. They're always talking what is good, truly good, what is honorable, what is beautiful. And that standard has been reversed in the 20th century to just mere expression. It's back to an animalistic concept of phone. Just express yourself. This is the expressive conduct that the Supreme Court talks about. You're just going to emote passion, whatever. I can say it. And they've said, no, this is what the First Amendment protects. So it's a lie. That's not the American constitutional tradition. That's not the American political tradition. It's a total inverse and reversal of what the founders believed and what they practiced for hundreds of years. I mean, blasphemy laws continue well into the 20th century. Not always enforced, but on the books. And there was a understanding there that like there was the civil law element of it, and then there was the law of fashion, the kind of the decorum, and these work together. But all that's been reversed. And so what we have now is we have license. We just have nothing but license, which is a form of slavery to self. And like, all you got to do is read Book 8 of Plato's Republic. And once you have a democratic man who is full of passion and licentiousness, what comes after that? Tyranny, the rule of the tyrant. These people are unable to govern themselves, and so they must have a master to rule over them. That is what's at stake here. We're losing our ability to have self-government, constitutional government, and we are moving into the realm of having to be ruled by a tyrant to control us because we have no control over ourselves, our speech, and our political institutions. That's what's at stake.
Mm. Yeah, and at the same time that you have this kind of extreme license understanding of free speech, you have people making very strong defenses of the idea of some sort of federal Ministry of Information or misinformation. Is very Orwellian, and that's focused on truth or falsehood, or truth as understood by particular regime, which is just that is certainly the face of tyranny as well. So my next question for you is, what can we do as Christians living in this republic to guard and preserve the right? I think what you just laid out is something that in one form or another, all Christians or defenders of just, let's say, a truly historically based, faithful to the Constitution and our founding principles concept of what free speech actually is, and be able to articulate that and identify where we have gone wrong in our contemporary times here in America. It's sad and frightening, actually, because as you know, we are trending to, not just in this area, but in other areas as well, towards something tyrannical. And, may God help us to avoid that. I want to conclude just by asking a couple of questions that are more, personal for you as a Christian political scholar. Do you see your work as a political scholar as a divine calling? And if so, how do you specifically want to act on that calling?
Yes, I do. And the reason for that is I have been steeped in New England election sermons from the 17th and 18th century. For the past few years, I've been working on my dissertation, which deals in 18th century religion and politics. And what you find is the American political tradition viewed government as a divine ordinance from God. And if you go back to Calvin, he talks about the two kingdoms, the civil and political realm on the one hand and the church on the other. Martin Luther talked about the three estates, the family, the church, and the civil government. So this is a very reformed view that God has actually established different orders of government and associations among men for their well-being and their flourishing. And the civil government is not just a mere creation of man. It's not just a contract in which the will of man obtains or rules. It's not just a form of conventionalism all the way down, and we can do whatever we want as long as we agree to it or consent to it. That's kind of a bare consent standard, which is a perversion of what the founders believed. No, they said government itself, the very office, the very purpose, the ends of government is ordained of God. And they went right to Romans 13 and just like always exegeting Romans 13, 1 through 8, always, always, always. And the civil officials, they are diaconoi. They're deacons, ministers of God. They fulfill his will. And not to say that this puts the divine stamp of imprimatur on every single political ruler like Nero or whoever, but it's to say that the office, the purpose, the origin of the office and its ends have a divine approval and or origination and order in society. And so when I, as a Christian, I'm part of the local church, believer since I was a young kid, saved by grace through faith, continually being refined through Christian discipleship. I am a Christian, I'm a part of the church, but I do all my work in official, scholarly, and professional work in civil government. But to me, it's not, it's another divine ordinance of God, and it is for man's well-being. You cannot have a good society, a peaceful society, a well-ordered society, or even a good life without civil order. Without civil order, you have anarchy, you have chaos, you have a strong man that arises, or some kind of tribal feuding. And with too much with wrongly ordered civil power, you have tyranny. So on the one hand, you either have the state of mankind before the flood. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes and they all killed each other. Or you have Babel after the flood. All mankind got together and tried to create a tyrannical and imperial order that would reach up to heaven and make man God. No, God said, I'm going to call Abraham and I am going to make your name great. I'm going to make you into a great nation and your descendants great through you. God's purpose for civil government, I really think the biblical teaching is that it's a kind of nationhood or nationalism of sorts, in which each people will have an ordering, that is commensurate with who they are, their geography, their language, their way of life, and so forth. So I do think of my work as being part of a divine calling because I work as a Christian in the with the realm of ecclesiastical government, but I work in civil government. Both of these are divine ordinances and offices created by God for the flourishing of humans.
That's really good. All right. So the question I like to conclude all our conversations with is the most broad and really the ultimate question for all of us, whatever our walk of life is professionally, whatever our personal interests are. And that is, what is your view of the meaning of life, and how has your professional work, how does it aim to work out that conviction in practice?
Yeah, this answer goes along with what I was just saying in many ways. Yeah, I mean, the meaning of life, it's a life well lived. It's a life of human excellence for God's glory. Both, how we're distinct from the animals and we're distinct from God. But we are called to be recreated in Christ's image. And Christ is truly man and truly God. And so we are in many ways called to not just human excellence, but a kind of a divine calling, a divine excellence as well. And so, this can be lived out in many different areas of life, many different professions, whether you're married or unmarried, whether you live on this continent or that continent, or speak this language or that language. So I certainly think that there's many expressions of a life well lived to the glory of God. But in terms of my work, there's always this tension in Christianity and politics of, well, aren't you paying too much attention to the temporal realm? Don't you care too much about public utilities and not about the gospel? Like, why aren't you preaching the gospel? Why aren't you concerned about heavenly things? I mean, like, these are light and temporary matters, Paul tells us. There's eternal glory. Why aren't you focused on that? That's what a true Christian would do. Eternal glory, be focused on those things, a heavenly perspective. And my response is yes, in a sense, but also, Christ was incarnate. He came to earth. He lived as a human being. He cares about our bodies. We are not divided persons between the body and soul. And it's not just that we will die and go to heaven, our soul will survive the body. It's that Christ will come back. The new Jerusalem will come back. There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. And we will live a heavenly, corporeal, incarnate life on this earth. And where you will faithful with little now, you will be entrusted faithful with much then. So there will be civil government in heaven. There will be civil order. And so the work that I do now is not unrelated to the reward that happens then. It's not to say that if you were impoverished and it was tyranny and war and civil war and bloodshed and famine and your wife and children are killed and you're ground to the dust, that you can't still live a good life pleasing to God and, not curse him to your dying breath and God will reward you. It's true. But that is not what God wants for us. He wants us to flourish. He wants us to have the experience abundant life, the fullness of life. And that includes having things like civil peace and functional families and robust churches and running water that's clean and doesn't kill us. I mean, all of these things, they're all of this tangible and enfleshed way of living. This is all part of God's created world. The creation is groaning and he wants to restore it. And I see my work in civil and political, philosophy and government as part of that vision of restoring God's creation, of tasting a little bit of what we will know in full in the life to come. So I think that these things go together. I think that this is the Reformed tradition. It's the American political tradition. I see no conflict or contradiction between them. I'm neither a pietist nor am I some kind of immanentization of the eschaton, adherent. It's not abandoning life now for some spiritual existence only, nor is it trying to bring heaven to earth. There's a middle ground. There's a way to hold these together. That a lot of my work is articulating and showing how this can be done the healthy way, both biblically and historically and politically in the American tradition, because I think Americans got it right for a long time.
That's great. And it's hard not to see it, the point you just made so well, powerfully endorsed by the very life of the Son of God, right? When Jesus came to earth, he spent apparently most of his adult life doing, well, he was a carpenter. So whether he was a woodworker or a stonemason or both, he spent many years doing this, maybe much longer in terms of just the total amount of time that he devoted, to his work, doing these very tangible, practical kinds of tasks to make people's physical conditions better. And it's easy to lose sight of that. But of course, there's a divine point in everything that God does, and how much more so in the life that Jesus, the Son of God, lived. So thank you, Ben. This is great. I enjoyed our conversation, and I commend you in the work that you're doing. Continue this conversation at another time.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center podcast. We gave you our thoughts. Now let us know what you think. Email us at podcast@kalos.center.